So today we're going to talk about The Nameless City by H.P. Lovecraft. This story is loved by many Lovecraft fans because it introduces a whole basis of a storyline which then continues in many of Lovecraft's other works. So it's sort of his foundation piece in that sense. And Lovecraft himself really loved this piece and loved this world that he was creating, and he tried many times to get it published in a variety of places. He did get it published in one or two places, but many publishers turned it down. And to me, it's not surprising why they turned it down. It is a very long slog. And, from Lovecraft's point of view, he was creating this beautiful world that he really adored. And it was worth all of the descriptions and the long, drawn-out process. But for a reader, it can be sort of tedious at some point, because really it is just about a person who is out wandering around the Middle East somewhere, and he finds an ancient town, and then he finds an ancient temple, and he is slowly descending through it. And it takes him a long time to get through this temple to finally get to the thing that happens. And it's just this one man's experience going through all of this. But, then people liked the Tom Hanks movie, whose now name I've forgotten, about him living on an island and all he does is hang out on the island with his volleyball friend, Wilson. So there is something to be said for this kind of story. But I found it a bit tedious to read and found myself skipping through it and having to go back and make myself read some of the scenes, which is odd because I really like the way he describes things. I like the language that he uses and the vocabulary that he uses, but at some point it just gets to be too much discussing the same rocks or whatever over and over again, and I just want the story to move on and find out what's happening. Some people think that the character dies at the end, but it says right here at the beginning, I alone have seen it, and that is why no other face bears such hideous lines of fear as mine, why no other man shivers so horribly when the night wind rattles the windows. So you really get the sense that he's telling this after he's survived and he's come back out to civilization, and he's reciting the tale of what happened to him. So he is out in the middle of a vast desert. He's a archaeologist / explorer. And he finally finds a nameless city that he has been looking for a long time. This is a completely ancient city. It's before the eldest pyramid. It's before the bricks of Babylon were even baked. So it's a very secret location that no one else has ever seen. There's no legend so old as to give it a name or to recall that it was ever alive. So it's a much ancient location. So say that some of the locals knew that it was around there somewhere and they shunned it because it was so dangerous, and he went in there alone with his camel, and he spots it, and then he's afraid of it, and he stops and he waits for dawn to come. And the dawn is slowly coming, and there's a moaning and a storm of sand happening as dawn is coming. And then the blazing edge of the sun lifts up, and now, it's dawn. And he hears crash of musical metal as the sun is rising, and he finally leads his camel across the sand to be able to go to this place which he alone of living men has seen. All right, so he goes wandering amongst the foundations of the houses and palaces. He can't find any sort of carving or inscription to give a sense of what type of people lived here. And he talks about the feeling unwholesome because it's so ancient, and that there were proportions and dimensions of the ruins that felt unnatural. I had with me many tools, and dug much within the walls of the obliterated edifices. So he is an archaeologist. He's not just a random traveler. He came here wanting to explore and dig and examine what was there, but he's not finding anything beyond, the walls and stones. So he's not finding cool tablets full of inscriptions or anything like that. But he keeps looking. So he keeps digging around. Progress is slow. He's not finding anything. And when night comes, then he feels a chill wind, so he goes back out of the city again, and he sees again these sandstorms blowing around. So he wakes again at dawn, had some awful dreams, and he goes looking around in the ruins looking for something and can't find much of anything. He just finds empty streets and outlines of tumbled down buildings, and he is, I suppose, a little sad that he can't find anything in there. And then he sees off in the distance a cliff, and he says, oh, well, maybe there's something to find over in the cliff, and he finds that there's little squat rock houses or temples, and maybe there's something in there, even if the city that I found doesn't have anything in it. So he finds that these cliff openings are very low, so he has to get down and crawl through them, and he's got a torch with him to try to see what he's doing once he gets into the deeper dark of these caves. And he assumes that one of them is a temple, and again, everything is very low down. He finds little pillars and altars, but he's not finding any sculpture or frescoes or any sort of language or depictions that he could work with. So he's still looking around with his torch, and then he has darkness come again, and he finds more stones, and all of these rooms are low, so he's having to crawl around, and there's still wind noise outside. So when he goes back out, now the moon's out, and he sees that the wind is coming from a particular rock fissure. So he decides to go over and take a look at where this wind is blowing out from. And there's a sand cloud being blown out, and he gets his way through the sand cloud, and he finds that the wind is blowing pretty strongly out of this crevice in the rock. And then it finally calms down. So he decides, of course, that he has to go into this crevice and see what's going on here. So he descends into the temple, and he sees that there's a little bit of art in this one, which is something he's been looking for. He's looking for representations of this ancient culture. So he sees curvy linear carvings. He sees the pictorial art. He sees that this place has been carved out, that it wasn't just a cave, that it looks like it was carved by, something with some sort of intelligence. And then he sees that there is an artificial door chiseled into the rock. So now we have more sense that it was some sort of intelligence that created this area. And now there's a black tunnel with an arching roof that leads down a flight of steps. So he's really excited because he's found this cave, and maybe in this cave area he'll find pottery and tablets with carvings on them and all that other kind of stuff. So this place is so steep that he has to go down feet first as though on a ladder. Now, I've been in the lava tubes in Hawaii, and they get narrower and narrower. I would not be heading all alone in the middle of the desert with no one but my camel down feet first into this place, because if you get stuck, then you're just going to die. So clearly this person is much more of an avid adventurer than I am, that he doesn't even have anywhere near him, and we don't get the sense that anyone even knows where he is or that he's in here. So if you get stuck, he will just die. But he is on the prowl for exploration, and he doesn't care. So this narrow passage keeps going down like a hideous haunted well. He's holding the torch over his head because it's so skinny. He loses track of the time, and he has to wriggle feet first through some of the passages, holding the torch over his head. The place was not high enough for kneeling. No. So this is part of the horror sense of it. And, as well, I've complained about some of Lovecraft's other pieces about, just quiet flats of mud not being very scary. This one is much more traumatic for me to imagine that he's going through these things. Now, I wish that he had more about what it smelled like or what it felt like or anything, because the only real sense that we get is that it's all very narrow. And narrowness is enough for me, because I don't like being in those kinds of tiny places where if you get stuck, you might not be able to get out again. But it'd be nice if there was more senses being involved here. So while he's crawling around or even wriggling around, because he's not even got enough space to crawl, he starts deciding that he's going to recite to himself various strange poetry and sing-song about reservoirs of darkness, black as witches' cauldrons. Yeah, I don't know if I would be reciting things like that when I was trapped, but I wouldn't be in this situation in the first place, so I suppose this is how he gets through it. Time ceased to exist when he finally gets to level floor, And he found himself in a place slightly higher than the rooms, and he could not quite stand, but he could kneel upright. And now he's shuffling and creeping on his knees. And the sides of either side of this narrow passage have cases of wood with glass fronts. So now suddenly he's gone from being in this ancient place that barely had rocks that were carved into things and no real language or symbols or anything like that. And now we've got polished wood and glass. And he shuddered at the possible implications. And they were arranged along the side of the passage at regular intervals. They were oblong and horizontal, hideously like coffins in shape and size, and they were fastened. So I thought somewhere in here his torch went out. Yes. So 2 paragraphs above it says his failing torch went out. So it seems very suspicious to me that, he's deep underground, that now it is pitch black, that how does he know that these things are of glass fronts and cases of wood? I mean, he could assume that it was glass feeling, but there could be all sorts of other things that are glass feeling. And he could assume that there were cases of wood, but again, it's polished wood. And there were other things that could feel like polished wood. I mean, they could have been plastic or something. Transparent aluminum. So I find it a little iffy that he describes things with sight kinds of terms and doesn't go into the texture. I think this is a place that he really could have had a lot of fun with textures and smells and so on if it is pitch black, because now all he can rely on is his other senses. And instead he just goes with sight-based things. And then he says, I saw that the passage was a long one. And he can't because it is pitch black. So why would you even say that? You could say that I sensed that the air was moving and that it felt like wind was coming from a distance or something, or I heard the wind blowing from a distance. So anyway, I have issue with that. And he's just going forward in the pitch blackness, going from side to side to make sure that there are still the cases on either side of him. And he says things like, man is so used to thinking visually that I almost forgot the darkness and pictured the endless corridor of wood and glass. But I wish he didn't write it like that, because to me it takes away from the sense that he's in pitch blackness, which I think is a powerful part of this moment. So then finally a gradual glow comes from ahead, and now he can finally see because there's some sort of phosphorescence glowing from, who knows, algae or something, mold, fungus. And he realizes that he is in a place that has wood and glass, or at least wood-like and glass-like things around him. And that this place is full of magnificent and exotic art. There's rich, vivid, and daringly fantastic designs and pictures of murals all around him. The cases were strange golden wood, fronts of exquisite glass, and they have mummified forms of creatures in them, outreaching in grotesqueness, the most chaotic dreams of man. And I'll say that this was all based on a dream that he had, so it makes sense that it is a little dreamlike, and that it's just about him going through a world and exploring it. So then he says to convey any idea of these monstrosities impossible, but then he goes through a lot of detail in describing them, so it's clearly not impossible. They are reptiles, sort of like a crocodile, sort of like a seal, sort of the size of a small man, and their little front legs had flexible feet, sort of like human hands and human fingers, and they weren't anything that he had ever heard of in nature. So he thought that maybe these were all just fake creations, but then he decides these must actually be mummies of living things, and that they were gorgeously enrobed in the costliest of fabrics and lavishly laden with ornaments of gold, jewels, and unknown shining metals. If they were made with our kinds of fabrics, the fabrics would have mostly died away, unless we say that these stems were vacuum sealed. But since this is a alien race, who knows, they could have had special fabrics that were woven out of metals or something that would not dissolve away. I think it would be neat if he actually mentioned something like that, he's surprised that they haven't dissolved after all this time or whatever. So they says that they must have been important creatures since they are so featured on the walls and ceilings, that they've had all sorts of cities and gardens in these drawings to suit their dimensions. And he thinks for a while, well, maybe the drawings are sort of metaphorical like the wolves were in Rome, but he has also got these creatures in front of him, so it seems like they were actual things. So he's reading about the story of their history by looking at all of these different murals. And he keeps moving towards the light, which is this glowing fungus or whatever it is. And he sees that the story progresses, that this is a linear story being told in these murals. And he realizes that these reptile things seem to have had a really cool civilization, which had a written alphabet, and then they had all sorts of other features, that they had a very happy life. But then near the end, that the pictures were showing things being deserted and getting ruined, and everything, their civilization collapsed in essence. And their paintings were less skillful, so the artists were no longer being trained as well as their previous artists, and so on. There were emaciated priests, and so on. So the rise and fall of the reptile people. And as he's getting near the end, he sees a great gate, which is the source of all of this illuminating phosphorescence. And he is so amazed at what he sees beyond that he sees that it is an infinity of subterranean effulgence. Effulgence. It's pretty unusual for me to hit words that I'm not fully familiar with, which is part of the fun of reading Lovecraft. He's able to pull words out that are pretty impressive. So he gets to this opening and looks down, and he sees he's at the head of a steep flight of steps, and the glowingness conceals where they lead, so you can't even see past this doorway area to see where this glowingness is going to go. And there's a massive door of brass at this opening, and it's very decorated with all sorts of bas-reliefs, and it looks like if it closed, that it would completely block this glowing light from this area that he's in. So it's the demarcation between the glowing light and the darkness of the vaults that he has been walking through. And he sits alongside this door and thinks about everything that he's seen. He does try to move the door, which is currently sitting open, and he can't move it because it's so massive and huge. And so as he's sitting there and thinking about all of these murals and frescoes and so on, he thinks about the city that was outside and how everything was low, and he thinks about all of the temples that he saw and how everything was low, and he's getting this sense that these crawling creatures in these mummified forms were actual people who lived in the city. And he's really afraid of this thought that there were lots of reptile peoples all living in the city. But he's impressed by all the frescoes and how amazing they are. And then we go on. See, this is when my eyes start to glaze. The ancientness so vast that measurement is feeble. Frescoes showed oceans and continents that man has forgotten. We've already gone through all of this again. And I appreciate Lovecraft's adoration for all of this. But I can also see why the different publishers thought that it went on for a little too long. And while he's sitting there pondering all of these things, he starts getting the sense that the wind is happening again. And earlier when he was outside, he got the sense that the wind was going in one direction at dawn and out the other direction at dusk. And now the wind is starting up again, which must mean that maybe dusk is falling or something. And the volume is growing and growing, and he's feeling the strong wind going past him, and it's cold air flowing from the tunnels in the city above. And he's getting woken up by this, and he looks at his watch and realizes that sunrise is near, so he gets the sense that this gale is going to be sweeping down to its cavern home as it had swept forth in the evening. And he wasn't worried about this because it just seems a natural kind of, wind comes and goes at dawn and dusk. But then he starts to realize that the wind is actually really powerful, and it is all sucking in, and it's sucking in past him down this long tunnel towards the glowing light, and that he could actually be blown over by that. So he clutches vainly at the floor for fear of being swept bodily through the open gate into the phosphorescence abyss. And he hadn't realized it was going to be this strong, so now he's really worried because he doesn't want to go into that glowing light. He has no idea what's down there. And he's screaming frantically. He was almost mad, but his cries were lost in the hell-born babble of the howling wind wraiths. And he keeps trying to push against the wind not to get blown in there. and only the grim, brooding desert gods know what really took place, what indescribable struggles and scrambles in the dark I endured. And he's pulling and trying to hold rough against it. And then he heard the ghastly cursing and snarling of strange-tongued fiends. He saw outlined against the luminous ether that which could not be seen against the dusk of the corridor, a nightmare horde of rushing devils, hate-distorted, grossly panoplied, half-transparent devils of a race no man might mistake, the crawling reptiles of the Nameless City. And then, behind the last of the creatures, the great brazen door clanged shut with a deafening peal of metallic music. So he had never gone through the door, and the door was between him in the tomb and the light area. So if the door clung shut, it actually, closed the light area. And he says that he was plunged into the ghoul-peopled blackness of the earth's bowel. If he was on the inside with the light, then it would still be light. He's on the outside with the tomb, so now he's locked outside of the glowing area, which is why he's alive later to be able to tell this story. So the full line of these last paragraphs says, and as the wind died away, I was plunged into the ghoul-peopled blackness of earth's bowels. For behind the last of the creatures, the great brazen door clanged shut with a deafening peal of metallic music, whose reverberations swelled out to the distant world to hail the rising sun as Memnon hails it from the banks of the Nile. So he's saved. He's not sucked down with the alligator people, crocodile people, nightmare horde of rushing devils. Now, I don't know that I get the sense that there were actual... Well, I suppose he's saying that there were creatures outlined against the luminous ether. So it's not just that there's more of a mural on the other side of the door. It's that he thinks that he sees actual alive creatures, hate distorted, that are in with the glowingness, and that the door closes, and now he's safe because they're all on one side of the door and he's on the other side of the door. But I don't know, that just comes at the very end. We have a long, long story, which is just him about going through an empty city, which is a little low, and then going through some caves, which are a little low, and then finding this other cave where the wind's going in and out, and then going down into the twisty tunnels. And then eventually we get to a place that has mummified coffins, and it's only in this end section that it's wind. There's wind blowing him towards the light area, and when the wind stops, he sees some monsters, like in the very last paragraph, and then the door closes. So there's other stories of his, I think of Dagon, for example, that also had a lone person out dealing with things, but I enjoyed the travel much more. I guess the question is why. I don't know, there was a sense that they were trying to get something done, and here he's just wriggling through narrow, twisty passages all alike, and he's just climbing through dirt, and they're not even that well described, in the sense that, like I said, there seems to be a lot of site references, but not a lot of any other references. And I appreciate that they are narrow, so they have something that makes me concerned, but I'd like them to be richer, I suppose. And he just seems to be repeating a lot of the same things over and over again, and at some point I'd like something new. So I appreciate this as being the starting point for a world that is developing, and that he had a dream about this and he really wanted to write about his dream, but I think that he could have trimmed this quite a lot and still had the powerful essence of the story of him going to an ancient city, and then him going into the caves, and then wriggling through the scary narrow parts of the cave, and then coming about this great door and realizing about the alligator people, and then almost getting blown into it. But you could also say that for all of the slugging I had to do to get to that point, the almost blown into the alligator people section is super fast, and then it's just over immediately and he's alive. So I would have liked that part to be drawn out more, and all of the rest of this lead-in didn't need to be quite as long. And one of the phrases that I really liked, I'll mention, is right here in the beginning. This is only the second sentence, and Well, I might as well read the first two. So it starts with, when I drew nigh the nameless city, I knew it was accursed. I was traveling in a parched and terrible valley under the moon, and afar I saw it protruding uncannily above the sands, as parts of a corpse may protrude from an ill-made grave. So I really loved this intro. The intro was great, and if more of it was that concise and powerful, then I think I would have enjoyed it much better. That this could have been trimmed down a lot without the repetition of similar kinds of scenes that then slow us down from getting to the ending point. What else? I appreciate that it doesn't seem to have some of the racism issues, unless I'm just like not even seeing them anymore, because I think that at least they were mild in this one and not as egregious as in some of the other stories. It's still a lone man, but I mean, you can't even complain about lack of women because there isn't anyone else at all. There's just a man against the desert with a camel. So I appreciate that part, especially because it came from a dream. So that makes sense because of the dream aspect of it. And no, I think maybe we were fairly safe from some of the other issues that I tend to have with the way Lovecraft writes. And I did love his language, the way that he describes things as far as he does describe things. But it'd be nice if he brought in some more senses and trimmed down his general paragraph after paragraph after paragraph saying reasonably the same thing. So let me know what your thoughts are about the Nameless City. I would say that I really enjoyed the storyline and the descriptions, but I think it could have been edited and trimmed down and had some more senses brought into it. So I would love to hear your thoughts about it.